Our next guest is neurodivergent consultant with a strong interest in autism. She has multiple degrees, is a published researcher and co-founder of Diagnostic and Therapeutic Services National PEKE Centre. With 20 years experience, her mission is to empower and educate others to understand neuro-differences. Today we are talking about parenting neurodivergent children, supporting neurodivergent communities, and the role of play for neurodivergent children and adults. A big warm welcome to the Wearthy virtual studio, Christina Keeble.
Thank you so much, Lucas. It's lovely to be here.
I've been really excited about this chat and having you on board with your wealth of knowledge to share with our listeners. It's something we're hearing more and more of. How do we support neurodivergent children? The services schools are offering. In my own journey with my son going to school and going through NDIS assessment and all of those things, and having that additional support for him as he starts school, it's all front of mind right now. So this is a great time, and also talking to principals and directors of childcare centres and just being like, they're kind of, I'm feeling they're a bit of a loss at the moment. It's like, what direction do we take now? Because it seems to be, and I'd love your opinion on it, could lead into our first question. Are neurodifferences increasing, or is it just a better understanding in recent times?
Yeah, that is a great question and a common one. And it's so definitely we're seeing more diagnoses of neurodivergent children and adults, and particularly those like myself, who's a late diagnosed adult. I was diagnosed after my children, and it was going through the process with them that I realized, wait a minute, this is, it's I feel the same. And it's really in a lot of hindsight. Now, saying that, the reason there's more diagnoses is that there is a much better understanding of what the spectrum of neurodivergencies look like. In my growing up, in my era, in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't the understanding of, the full understanding of what the autism or ADHD spectrum looked like. And I have both those labels now. Back then, there wasn't a label that I fit under. And my challenges presented in a way that was socially acceptable. It doesn't mean that the challenges weren't there. It was just that, according to the school, because I was academically gifted, and I wasn't failing, I wasn't a behavior problem, according to the school, because I don't like that word in general, but in my era, I was the quirky, nerdy, socially awkward kid. Where nowadays we're recognizing that the struggle is still there, but it was very much internalized and very much was affecting mental health and whatnot. And it's a very, I could talk all day about this, but essentially, to answer your question, it's we are seeing more accurate diagnoses, which I think is a really positive thing, and it is due to a broader understanding of challenges that those with neurodivergent brains face.
Yeah, and we've used the word about 40 times since we've started, but just so we are clear on terms, so we're all talking about the same thing, could you give your definition of neurodivergent?
Yeah, definitely. Before that, though, I want to talk about neurodiversity. So neurodivergent stems from that concept, and neurodiversity, just to put it as simple as I can, represents all brains within our species. All brains. Now, someone who is neurodivergent is someone whose brain technically diverges from the majority. And so what it is nowadays we're recognizing it as a natural variation of brains within our species. So not that there's something wrong or deficit based, but that there is a different processing or operating system, if you like, to how we experience the world, with sensory information and other information coming in, how we process the information, and then how we respond to the information. And those who get these labels, they tend to include things such as autism, ADHD, all of the learning differences like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Tourette syndrome, and there's many more. That's not an exhaustive list, but basically it represents those individuals whose brains, when they come into this world, are wired differently.
And hence that when this comes up in conversation, so many people are like, oh, well, I think I've got a bit of that. I think I've got a bit of that.
It is, and it's such a, you know, I'm guilty of that before I was formally diagnosed. And prior to that, I self-identified for nearly 2 years, and I know a lot of neurodivergent adults and parents in particular who self-identify because it's a bit of a privilege to be able to afford a diagnosis. As an adult, there's no means to get support. But I guess when you look at it, and there's a lot of talk about this within the, you know, adult neurodivergent community, is that, you know, we can completely relate and understand or have characteristics similar to somebody else, but the reality is not everybody is neurodivergent. And that, you know, I guess some of the discussion around it involves, you know, if we say, oh, everybody is a little bit this, then it actually dismisses the challenges that come along with that. And it is a different operating system, but I totally understand the meaning behind that, and, you know, that relating and understanding certain aspects of that.
And so just to clarify, if we've got 100 people, a majority of that 100 people would be like a typical.
Yep. Neurotypical.
Neurotypical, and then whoever sits outside that would have that
neurodivergency. And it is based around the way that I explain it, and this has evolved over the years, but now in the era that we're in, I always explain it iPhone versus Android example when you look at phones. So both phones make phone calls, make texts, can download apps. However, you need to use the right charger for the right phone, otherwise your phone's not going to charge, and you need to go to the right app store in order to download the apps. So basically it's a different processing system, and it's about how, you know, if you think about children, how they interpret and experience the world around them, including the sensory information, the verbal, the, you know, just all of the world coming in, it's experienced differently.
Yeah. Do you think that like, just in that scenario where people are, I'm a little bit of this, I'm a little bit of that, you think that's great evidence of the dropping down of the stigma being washed away around that identity, because people are more willing to be like, oh yeah.
I think,
opposed to like, oh, that in my era in the 80s being diagnosed with ADD, it was like, oh, the ADD kid. Yeah. No one wanted to be associated with that, and now people are like, yeah. Okay.
And I see it as a genuine attempt to kind of bridge that gap and share, like, no, I understand where you're coming from, you know. So I do see that as a positive. I know definitely I think one of the great things that I have seen in schools, and particularly one of the schools that my children have attended in the past, was this great series of lessons around basically different brain types within their thing, you know, and the without singling any child out, the teacher had this beautiful bunch of videos and things describing, you know, what it's like to be autistic or ADHD. And I heard so many beautiful stories of other kids in the classroom going, oh, that's like me too. And so all the kids who did have the labels and knew of it spoke up, and then other kids who didn't, you know, they were like, oh yeah, I must be. It was just this beautiful, you know, acknowledgement and understanding of differences. And also the focus was, how do we be a good friend to each other when we have these differences, which was lovely.
There's language used in my daughter's classrooms around the rainbow brain type of scenario, which is really lovely, but they've really taken that on board, and people are like, oh, I'm like that too. And it's like lovely. It's that camaraderie around difference, opposed to it being like, that definition is like liberating you and celebrating you, opposed to defining you and pushing you down.
Exactly. And that idea of like, okay, you know, little Sarah or little, you know, Seth, you know, maybe they're struggling with something, you know, and they come alongside them as a friend and advocate for them and go, hey, you know, they're, you know, and again, looking at that rainbow brain and where they, and it's just a lovely, yeah, a really lovely, positive way to highlight and connect children with their differences and celebrate and support, like you said.
Yeah. Talk about supporting. I've got like this fantastic expert, and it would be a missed opportunity to leverage on that to answer my wife's question. The question she asked me the other day was, from an ADD standpoint, like, what goes on in your brain?
Oh.
And I was like, so if you got a pinball machine,
yeah,
that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
But I was hoping you could explain it, that neurotype a bit more clearer and define that.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I can only give my perspective, just like you. You know.
Yeah.
And I think for me, the point that it really was highlighted was when I first started taking medication for ADHD, and that was at just before I turned 38 years old, and so I'd gone through, you know, my life thinking this is what everybody experiences. I took the medication, and my brain went into what I call a massive slowdown. And I actually went to my husband and I said, oh my gosh, there's like nothing up there right now. And he's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, nothing's going in, like there's nothing in my brain. Like there's just quiet. Like there's nothing going on. And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, is that what it's like? I was like, do you have periods of time where nothing is happening up there? And he goes, yeah. And I'm like, so I didn't even know that people had space between thoughts or that there was quiet up there. So, and this phenomenon, I suppose, this big brain slowdown, as my brain must have, you know, it habituated to the medication, I started, and my what do you call it? The thinking and processing slowed right down. That came back. I've got my processing speed back and thinking, and I have busyness up there again. But it took about 2 months, and it just really highlighted to me how busy my brain is. There's never a moment of just quiet. There's always multiple thinking going on. I've noticed when I'm feeling overloaded, either like sensory wise, or if I haven't taken my medication in particular, but also more stress, the more stressed I experience, things like that, I get this fogginess and this inability to think clearly and make decisions clearly. And that's when I usually know I've not taken my tablets. When I take them, I have this ability to, it feels clear, like the fog is lifted, and I have this ability to multitask better. Certain things I'll never be good at is cooking, and it hasn't. I'm still like the queen of burning everything, including chicken nuggets. But there's just this constant flow of ideas, and yeah, I guess that's how I experience it. And when I get asked a question, or if I'm doing something, there's always, like, I've learned to just stop and let someone know I'm just thinking, give me a minute, and I'm like looking at all the different angles all at the same time and trying to pick out, so that I guess that's kind of the best way. It's like a really busy road.
Yeah, and from like brain structure, the science behind it, what's going on for people with that neurotype? Is it like a heightened activation of a certain area? Is it a pathway of the brain that takes a detour? What's going on up there?
Look, this is not my strongest suit, so I'll do my best to answer. So when it comes to the brain and ADHD in particular, what's happening there is and to be honest, researchers aren't even 100% sure the way it all works and the way medication works, but what my understanding is that it's a lack of dopamine, and the dopamine, it can either be underproduced or it's not hanging out around the brain long enough. And what the different medications do, and they all work differently on the receptors and the reuptake part between the communication side of the brain, is that it helps the dopamine hang out longer by blocking some of the things that the reuptake things that suck it up is my professional answer.
Yeah.
So that's a part of, so the main thing that ADHDers and ADDers, it's about getting these dopamine hits. And that's why things such as it can be, I see a lot in chats and things like that, you know, we're seeking things. Some are the thrill seekers, and so that's where their dopamine hit comes from, and there's different ways that we get that, and that's why strategies such as really communicating to an ADHD kid that they're doing a great job, or, you know, really reinforcing through us, the adults, acknowledging, you know, their progress or how great they've done, and really shifting it to a positive focus excuse me, is so effective, because you get that dopamine hit from things like that.
Yeah, it gets them operating on that dopamine-based system opposed to an adrenaline-based system, which needs to be that lever that we pull, and the priority to support our children is get them out of that adrenaline space. I love the illustration that Tom Hartman paints and on ADHD is like his book Surviving as a Hunter in a Farmer's World. It's about, you know, you want to chase the animal to get that stimulation that pulls in that focus. The farmer is the one that's going to set their crop and be meticulous and happy to just do the math and wait.
Yes.
And ADHD is the hunter remnants going on.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
And to switch gears and to the other side of neurodivergence, we're experiencing a lot of now is autism and the autism spectrum. So from that standpoint, you've obviously diagnosed as liberated by your diagnosis, I like to say, as an adult, but you also went through that experience with your children. Is your experience supporting your children what spiked your interest in this field and set the wheels in motion?
No, actually. So I actually fell into, discovered autism, I suppose. This is back when I was at uni in the US, which is where I'm originally from, and I was studying psychology, and I was going down the path and needed to do some volunteering to make the application so I could get into the master's program there. And I ended up volunteering at this amazing, innovative preschool that was basically, the ratio was 75% children with additional needs to 25% neurotypical children. And it was this amazing venture to see, you know, and to show and highlight the benefits of really focusing on that, because at the time in the US, unfortunately, was very segregated, the education system. And that's where I first came across working with neurodivergent children, and I just fell in love with it. And it totally switched my path. I actually ended up, when I came to Australia, doing teaching, and I got a master's in special ed, and I just knew as soon as I you know, had experience there, I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I've taught at autism specific schools, excuse me, everywhere, and also other specialist settings from early childhood through to transitioning to adulthood. And I had this, I guess it became a specialty, a bit of a knack for neurodivergent children, and I just seemed to really get them and be able to understand their communication, in particular the highly sensory kids and those who you know, don't have, you know, are non-speaking. And now I think I understand why. I understand them because I'm one of them. And when my children went along this journey, I thought I was prepared, I suppose. I had an idea of the process. There was no stigma in my mind. I felt like I was pretty well equipped, as best I could, to support them. However, the actual going through the diagnostic process, which it was more heartbreaking than I could imagine. And it had nothing to do with my children. It was the way that the system works and the language that the professionals used, and the fact that as this was going on, my perfect little child next to me was hearing these things, and I'm trying to, you know, shield them from it, and sometimes the doctor's office was too small to exclude them, you know, so they didn't hear things. And and basically that's what led to me creating with my business partner Rebecca Perkins the National PEKE Centre, because we want to change that experience. But also that's what led me, during this process, I saw my childhood reflected back at me through my children. Yeah.
And what were the types of things that were being said, and hopefully is there evidence that we're moving past that now?
Yeah, everything was really focused on, it was very deficit based, like what they weren't achieving, what they were failing at, what the behavior problem was, where, in our house and at that time and even now, we acknowledge that all children have challenges. Neurotypical or not, no one gets through life without challenges. It's what helps us grow, and builds resilience and everything. But just, it was so heavily focused on just accumulating all the negative, what the medical, developmental milestones and everything. It was just so negative based. And I remember a couple of times with my first, with my second, I was more equipped to shield them from that. But at times, unfortunately, my first child who went through the process heard things that I wish they hadn't. And, they were asking, why were they asking that about me? Why are they saying these things? And I could see, because I'm blessed in the fact that both my children are hyperverbal, and their language has always been very developed very early. And that, I was concerned that she was attempting to understand things that I didn't want her to understand because they weren't accurate. And so all of the things, I was, trying to manage that then also because of their self-esteem. And, I didn't want their self-esteem or their self-image to be tainted by what they were hearing.
Yeah, is that a common approach we're seeing in supporting autism? Is about and the corner we've turned is that, okay, we're actually considering them in the process now, and their voice, even if they don't have a voice, prioritizing the children in the middle of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, one of the big things, for example, when I sat back and thought, how can we make this, if we're going to create, a place where we're going to be supporting children, how can we make this better? One of the things is we never talk about the child in front of the child like they're not there. And, if we are going to have these interactions, we bring them into it, and we want their feedback and their input, and we use language that doesn't dismiss challenges, but that's not soul destroying, if that makes sense. Yeah. And it really is. It's a slow shift, but it is happening, this shift towards acknowledging and starting to really respect and understand that these differences aren't a failing. It's just a difference, and it's helping not only, at the moment, in the past, a lot of the onus has been put back on the child. So the autistic child or the ADHD kid or the kid with a disability to meet society's norms and expectations. Yeah. Where now, what we're trying to do in my line of work, but also I know a lot of other practitioners are as well, is really helping, neurotypical children understand differences, but also helping the neurodivergent children understand themselves, understand others, and then trying to bridge that gap between them to facilitate, communication and interaction and play and everything.
And what's going on for a child? I know there's a spectrum, and that was my next question. Yeah. But for the listeners, what is autism? Let's go simple.
Yeah, it's simple, but it's not.
Simple, but the most complex.
I was gonna say that's the least simple question. Yeah. No, but it is a spectrum, and it's a collection of characteristics that, at the moment, the way it's diagnosed is through the DSM-5 TR, I believe, just was released a couple months ago, and unfortunately, it does focus on these deficit-based things, but basically the differences fall in a few areas, including differences in communication, differences in sensory processing, so the information coming in, differences in their play and their interests, and what I call like their passions. Differences in intensity, differences in the way that they do those things, and basically it's differences in processing and experiencing the world, and then their responses to that.
Yeah. It's a hard one. Like my mind boggles when you try to articulate what it is for myself, and I'm like, that is a very complex avenue to go down. But you're using the National PEKE Centre to support families.
Yes.
With all different types of therapies that you're offering. You're offering this very holistic approach. Can you it's quite exciting what you're doing there.
Yeah.
So can you share with our listeners what you're doing with PEKE and the impact it's having?
Yes. So basically what we're trying to do at National PEKE Centre is, like you said, do this holistic approach where everyone who practices with us or who works for us is what's called uses neurodivergent affirming practices, and works from a strengths-based client-led model, not from a deficit-based medicalized model. And also that everyone who works with us, everything that we do is grounded in the lived experience. So both myself and my business partner were neurodivergent, and our children are. We actually have multiple therapists who are neurodivergent and neurodivergent parents, which is lovely. And we have those who are not as well. And it's really, we're trying to create the culture of one where neurodiversity, neurodivergencies are celebrated, and that it's here it's a bonus. If you come in and you tell me you're autistic and ADHD, and it's like, awesome, you're part of us, you're one of us, and I know
Get their members card.
Yeah, that's right. It was really sweet at the beginning, when we had a couple of neurodivergent therapists and a couple who weren't, the ones who weren't, like, they'd take this self-test and they're like, oh man, I really wanted to be creating this culture around that. And also one where we support the parents or carers in this as well. I think this is one of the features that makes us unique. So we have we've created this role, if you like. It's called the support specialist. And the role of the support specialist is to kind of keep this overview of the family ecosystem, or the support ecosystem of the individual, because we do see clients across the lifespan. So let's say, a child comes and they start to CROT. Well, they don't live in a bubble. They may be the one with the NDIS plan, but there's usually maybe a mom and a dad and a grandparent or a sibling all in the house. And the support specialist role is just to make sure that everything else is ticking along okay. Because if we're going to support the child, let's say with OT, and at home, mom or dad or whoever, grandma, is struggling with, getting food on the table, that's going to impact what's happening with the child. And so we need to make sure that they receive the services that they need to be okay, so they can support the child with the plan, so to speak, or with the neurodivergency. So we take this very holistic approach, because anything that benefits their supports benefits the child.
And I love the fact that it's the extended. For me, I think about when I was sent to OT. I went to the medical centre, and I did these weird exercises. No one could tell me what I was doing and why I had to do them. Yeah. And then I'd go home and I'd be like, okay, what's that about?
What was that about?
I don't know. And there was it wasn't shared, it was only for a reason. It was like, hey, go do this thing, come back.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. It is nice to know why you're doing something. Oh.
Yes. But it's great to see like that. And what's your goal for PEKE? What do you want to see it develop into?
So we want it to go nationwide. Right now, Cranbourne is our first centre, and before the end of the year, we're opening our second centre in the west of Melbourne. And we want it to be nationwide, and we want the way we practice to be the standard. And we want to basically shift the expectation away from behaviorist-based approaches. This is a bit controversial, but we're anti-ABA. So shift away from...
Can you break that down for us, for the people that aren't listening?
Yes.
What's ABA?
Sorry?
Away from behavioural management.
Yeah. So basically, ABA is applied behavior analysis, is the technical term. And behaviorist-based practices, which ABA is one that focuses on reward and consequences to changing behavior of an individual. And there is, in the past, and actually still, ABA a lot of the times is touted as the number one, if not the only, intervention for autistic children or children with behavior challenges, as they say. And the reason I'm so passionate against it is because while I was never an ABA practitioner, before I had my family and went on this journey, I was using behavior-based practices professionally because that was the gold standard, so to speak. And through my journey with my kids and my family, what I thought I was doing was correct. I was actually causing damage to my children and unintentionally induced trauma within them. And in hindsight now, I see things in the past that I've done and wished that, I'd had known of other ways to support the kids that I worked with, because there definitely would have been, trauma as a result of that.
What's some of those examples of behavioural techniques that you've...
So at the most basic, things like sticker charts. If you do this, you get a sticker. If you get 5 stickers, you get the prize, right? That, at its very basic, is behavior. And then the thing is, the consequence is if they don't do the task or meet the demand, then they don't receive the sticker, which means eventually, it takes away from them experiencing the prize. Now, the thing about that is when we use these extrinsic or these things that are outside of ourselves, like stickers and rewards, to motivate children, what we do is we're doing them a disservice, and we're teaching them to modify their behavior to do what we want, and then they get this thing in return. The problem is research shows that with these approaches, yes, it changes behavior, and depending on certain circumstances, yes, it can change it very quickly. But what it doesn't show is the cost and the toll that these practices take. So it doesn't allow the children to really tune in to their internal their internal idea of what is, their internal moral compass about what is right and what is wrong, because it moves it externally and it's all about the thing. If it's in relation to challenging or unsafe behaviors, which is really a sign of distress from the child, and we really should be looking at addressing why is this child experiencing this level of heightened distress in their nervous system. It doesn't look at any of that. It's basically just trying to change what they do. It only works when the threat, so the person who gives the reward or the consequence, which again, we're not allowed to use negative consequences in the education system, but missing out is a negative consequence. It's only effective when that is present. And it's all around motivators and finding a strong enough motivator and things. And the reality is, what I've learned is relationship-based practices are the way to go, because they are trauma-informed, and there is nothing stronger than a positive, safe, and trusting relationship between you and a child. And not only does that support their development, but also it allows them, to tune in and develop this internal moral compass and follow and learn that way.
Yeah, and that's where my passion lies, is in creating those environments where the child can navigate them and set their own goals and set their achievement. I talk a lot to educators about, we set up the obstacle course and now everyone does it. or a child's like coming up against a bit of a challenge and we jump in and we're like, pull with your arms, push with your legs.
Yeah.
So their fulfillment is based on themselves achieving what you've set for them. Exactly. And they get in this external gratification type of mode where it's like, hey, give me the confirmation that I'm good. Hey, give me my achievement, opposed to, hey, they set the goal. They might not be able to, even like classic ones like climb a tree, they might not be able to get up there.
Yeah.
But if we can support them and say, hey, you can't get there yet, you're going to get the bigger reward in the end, because they're going to set their own goal.
That's right.
And really internalize, hey, I am the master of my own surrounding. It is up to me to get joy and fulfillment around my environment, which then in turn sets that intrinsic motivation to explore and experience, overcome sensory processing challenges, and then activate their wonderment or their self-value at the core of who they are.
And I love that power of yet, that's so, when kids get that, it's so powerful, that whole, I always connect it to growth mindset. And it's such a powerful, it's such a tiny shift sometimes, but that has such a huge positive difference. And what you were doing there with jumping in and even just you modeling, how to do it, and then supporting by breaking it down so they can do it, that modeling and that, facilitates that trust, and that, you're a safe person to come to. And, I know at the moment, I'm thinking really little, right? But if we're taking these, if we're using and implementing these strategies now, and really this becomes the child's foundation, as the child grows and pushes into adolescence, which is a really risky period for children, what do all us parents want? We want the children to come to us when they're in a risky situation, right? So doing these strategies now when they're little gets that trust and shows them, what, I can turn to mom or dad when I need support, because they've always been there, even when things have been tough.
And equally, I have the capacity to solve this problem for myself. And if I can't, I know who I go to.
Exactly.
Opposed to, I don't know what I'm doing. Who's the closest people around me that I want approval from? It's my peers.
Yeah.
Peers at teens.
Exactly.
Is gonna end up challenging.
And exactly. And that whole, along the same path, so the reason I talk about what I do is because I've made all the mistakes connected to what I'm talking about, so I used to use these approaches that were very much only reinforcing, for example, with my attention, when the kids were doing what I wanted them to do. And that classic, which goes back to behavior stuff, ignoring or not paying attention to undesired behaviors. Now, again, on this shift from childhood to adolescence, I don't want the pattern to be that my children only see me paying attention to them when they're doing what I want, because when they're in those risk-taking situations and they're unable to solve it, I want them to seek me out. So, and that's, again, back to that relationship-based modeling and having this open communication and support with them, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And equally, having the confidence to let your child fail.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Is essential. We can have them come to us, but essentially you've got to get some dust on the knees.
Absolutely.
Sometimes, and you've got to be self-aware and confident enough to dust yourself off, keep going.
That's right.
But I love that definition of trauma. Is it could be perceived as anything that takes away your basic needs.
Yeah.
So that broadens the scope of trauma quite a lot.
Yeah, it does.
But equally, you need to overcome that smaller level of trauma, your basic needs.
Yeah.
Falling over and hurting your knee. Yeah, okay, you're not for a moment there, you're not feeling like you're in a safe and secure environment. But does the action reflect the environment, and is it suitable for that environment? Yes. So therefore, it's gonna you're gonna get one of those little achievement badges.
Yeah.
Each time it builds up the jacket.
Exactly. And that facilitates that resilience. and you know, through multiple experiences of that. And I think it's important also for our children to see us fail and to make mistakes, and model how to come back from that through our interactions with them and with other, you know, adults in their lives. I think that's a really
it's powerful. Like my daughter's just turned 8, so the cognitive competency of understanding stories and reflection is quite strong. And when we're talking about learnings and me sharing stories, I'm like, hey, yeah, I'll tell you a time when I failed.
Yeah.
It was magnificent and it was terrible. So it's really opening up that. To shift gears a bit, I'm talking to a lot of adults now around neurodivergence. As an adult, like, we come from like the 80s, 90s, where there wasn't that understanding. We've moved into an era where there is, and then there is more resources as an adult to understand. What's your advice and recommendations for adults that think they might be neurodivergent in some way? What's your advice to them?
Basically, you know, looking to other neurodivergent adults and reading or listening or, you know, seeking out their stories and their journeys. And one of the biggest things I think that is a challenge, I know it was a challenge for me on my journey to fully understanding or getting to that point where I go, you know what, I need to actually explore this, if I am neurodivergent or not. And my I guess barrier was really around the fact that the masking that I'd done for so long was, I didn't even have to think about it. So with masking, I mean, you know, suppressing my true self, so to speak, to fit in. And a lot of that, you know, goes back to, and I have very early memories of being in prep and watching other kids play and really working hard to copy them and mimic them, so I didn't stand out. And this continued through school. And I think as I started to read other stories of, you know, on social media or books or whatever, one of the ones I turned to was the Spectrum Women's magazine online. Obviously, coming as a woman, that one had a lot of stories that I could relate to. And going, okay, wait a minute, this is my story, you know, parts of this are my story too. And then really allowing myself to figure out what is my authentic self, you know, when I let go of the mask. And it's something that I'm still doing 4 years on. But I think listening to those who've gone through the journey can be helpful, and looking for the lived experience there.
And what's your advice for people that think that being diagnosed and taking like maybe a medicated route, that they're going to lose their power or lose who they are?
Well,
also, like, not just as an adult, there's so many families going through this real struggle with medicating their children. It's saying, well, if I medicate them, is it going to take away from who they are? Am I breaking them?
Yeah, no. So actually, I love talking about this. A couple of things. So when we think in particular about children, but any age, child, teen, adult, you know, if all of a sudden your doctor came to you and said, okay, you've developed diabetes and you now need to take insulin, you wouldn't hesitate. You'd be like, yes, give me the needle. We're going to inject this every day to support my child or to support myself, you know, because I'd like to continue to live, that kind of thing. And when we look at, there's a lot of stigma around medication, in particular with ADHD, because a lot of them are stimulants, and there is just this really strong stigma. But it's a similar thing in that, you know, the brain, for whatever reason, is either underproducing or it's not hanging out enough. And if our brain is missing it, then there should be no shame in providing it to, you know, to support ourselves to live our best life. And unfortunately, the statistics around the lifespan of, I know autistic individuals in particular, is not very pretty. And a lot of ADHDers I know, self-medicate in other ways, through addiction, through alcohol. I had a period of using alcohol to cope. And, to take the medication, I think is a much better
and also
route.
that tendency to be the risk takers.
That as well.
So risk takers, I'm not talking about going to jump out of a plane. I'm like
No.
risk taking in relationships, risk taking in day-to-day activities, and like the stewardship of your life.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I know through my journey, I actually took the medication before I medicated my kids. Just the way it all played out, I had about 6 months before we attempted the medication for my children. And so it gave me a good insight. I think at the beginning I was talking about how my brain did this massive slowdown. And one of the first thoughts I remember having was, wow, I wish I'd had this sooner. And it was thinking about how much easier certain things in my life would have been with that, especially around learning and all of that. And then the other thing, so just, I guess, so people understand, when I started my ADHD meds, I was already on a very low dose antidepressant for anxiety, because I've always struggled with anxiety. And I started the medication, it worked. By day 3, it was, really kicking in. And I noticed a positive, unexpected side effect was that my anxiety was gone. Now, this isn't everybody's story, but this is mine. And I felt like I had this hole in my stomach, like a fist-sized hole. And I realized that's where my anxiety sat in my body. And I spoke to my psychiatrist and I said, should I stop now taking my antidepressant? And he goes, no. He goes, it's working. He goes, and for some, the combination is what, in the chemistry, is what the brain needs. And I've continued to take it, and I've still, 4 years later, it relieves my anxiety, which has been a big factor, especially in relation to RSD.
And then contributing to your relationship positivity, and it's this cumulative snowball effect, isn't it?
Exactly.
You're taking less risk. You're more aware of yourself. Your concentration is just one tiny aspect of it. Or children with autistic children, there's a lot of focus on sensory processing, but it's just one little component of the bigger picture. It
is, and so at the time when I started taking it, we were a family in crisis and had been for a good 4 years. Nobody could help us. They just kept saying we're a tricky family, which we are. And I realized I had to be the one to do it. And the medication, so the diagnosis combined with the medication is what allowed me to get to a place where I was okay and coping, and then could put in strategies to then support our family. And now, thankfully, we are at a crisis. And I know if it wasn't for the medication, that wouldn't have happened. And the diagnosis was the number one best thing I've done for my mental health ever, unexpectedly.
It's brilliant. To change it up, I want to get some advice from you for our listeners.
Sure.
How do we best support the neurodivergent children in our world? I know it's a big spectrum and all children are different, but what's your number one recommendation for interacting and caring for neurodivergent children?
Yep. I always think starting where the child is at, so connecting with them, and the way, for example, going down, like when you break down an interaction or connection, even observing where the child's energy level is at. If they're a child that's quite reserved and quite lower energy, come in at that space. So meet them where they're at. Otherwise, if you have very excited energy, you might, they're very sensitive to that. They might scare them, and vice versa. If you have a kid that's really up here and really high energy, meet them there and match them, and then, focus on connecting with them the way they want to and what they enjoy, and kind of following their lead from there forward. And I guess the other big one is respecting their no's. If they have an indication that something is too much or the interaction needs to end, respect that. And then, you can always attempt to reconnect later.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And where can people find out more about your approach, the National PEKE Centre, your research, books, and people that just want to be educated more on the topic?
Yeah, so my website is my name, so it's ChristinaKeeble.com. And I have links to National PEKE Centre, and PEKE Centre, just so you know, is PEKE. Yeah, so not PEAK like the mountain, but PEKE Centre. We're on social media, we're on Facebook and Instagram, and I support through talks, through doing podcasts like this, seminars, workshops, but I also do one-on-one consults for families, carers and adults, neurodivergent adults themselves, and all of that information can be found on my website.
Excellent, and we'll put all the links in the show notes.
Awesome.
So people can just click on there, get straight there, not get distracted on the way like this guy would, and get to where you need to go straight away. To wrap up today, I just want to commend you on your achievement, especially from that family standpoint. It's easy to get the accolades, and you've done an amazing job with the PEKE Centre. However, to hear you take the step, you be brave, be bold, challenged, get uncomfortable for the sake of your family and demonstrate that, it's got to be one of the biggest achievements anyone could be blessed with. So well done for overcoming your own challenges, and thank you for sharing your wisdom, your message, and I look forward to learning more and on my journey, and how we can support more children, neurodivergent children, through play, through exploration.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share, and that you provide this awesome platform to do that. So thank you so much. It's much appreciated.
No problem. Thank you.